Take one, ma'am. They are blank pages for writing.
We can really have them.
A cold morning mist hangs low over the grounds of a recently liberated women's camp. The silence is strange, almost too soft for a place that had known years of commands barked through loudspeakers and the echo of boots on gravel. Now the gates stand open. The guards have fled, and the women, thin, exhausted, wrapped in whatever fabric still clings to their bodies, wait without knowing what comes next. American military trucks idle just beyond the watchtowers, their engines humming steadily in the damp air. A group of U.S. officers sets up a folding table, placing small objects on the wood. Not rations, not medical supplies, not documents demanding signatures, but notebooks, blank ones, stacks of them. The women stare, uncertain. For years, writing their thoughts could mean punishment. A diary was a threat, evidence, rebellion, a silent refusal to be erased. Now, an officer steps forward and gestures gently toward the table, encouraging them to take one. A few approach, hesitant, hands trembling as they lift the covers. Words they have not yet written begin pressing against their silence. And as the first page turns, the story behind this moment begins far earlier in a world collapsing around them. The moment those notebooks appeared in the spring of 1945 had roots deep in the final, chaotic year of the war. Europe was collapsing under the weight of a conflict that had consumed nations, armies, and civilian populations without restraint. By early 1945, the Allied push from west and east squeezed the remnants of Nazi Germany into a shrinking, desperate pocket. The Western Allies, American, British, Canadian, and French divisions, were advancing at a speed that overwhelmed German defensive lines, overrunning towns, airfields, factories, and the vast system of camps that had supplied the Reich with forced labor. Among these liberated camps were hundreds of sites holding female prisoners, Jewish women, Polish political detainees, French resistance couriers, Soviet forced labor conscripts, Dutch students, and German opponents of the regime. Many had been transferred repeatedly as the front moved. Others had survived selections, death marches, or winter starvation. Their lives had been controlled by regulations meant to break individuality. No private possessions, no written material, nothing that recorded thoughts or truth. Diaries were considered dangerous because they captured what the authorities wanted hidden: conditions, treatment, names of guards, acts of brutality, and the subtle ways prisoners resisted through humanity. By 1944, the German camp system had become more brutal than ever. Overcrowding grew as the SS evacuated prisoners westward to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Women were pushed onto packed trains or forced on long marches through snow and mud, often without food. Entire groups vanished on the road. When they reached new camps, the guards forbade writing more strictly than before. Even a scrap of paper could lead to beating, interrogation, or transfer to a punishment block. Secrecy was essential to the regime, both to maintain control and to hide evidence of crimes. The American Army first encountered major women's groups in early April 1945 as it crossed Germany's northern and central regions. These liberations were not always planned. Some happened as armored divisions outran their supply lines and unexpectedly reached previously unknown camps. Soldiers reported scenes of shock and silence. Women too weak to stand, others still believing that showing emotions might attract punishment. Many asked for permission before speaking. Some asked if the Americans were allowed to protect them or if the guards would return. The U.S. military had prepared broadly for the liberation of civilian populations, but the scale of what they found was beyond prediction. Reports sent back through division channels described malnutrition, untreated injuries, and psychological trauma so deep that normal human reactions, laughter, tears, even curiosity, seemed unfamiliar to many survivors. American officers were instructed to stabilize the camps, provide immediate medical care, and register displaced persons. But they noticed something else. Many survivors spoke rapidly when questioned, almost as if afraid the opportunity might disappear. It was clear that these women had carried a silent world inside them for years. As interrogators, chaplains, and military government officers listened, they realized the prisoners' memories were precise. Women recalled dates, names, routines, and the faces of fellow prisoners who had vanished along the way. They remembered the layout of barracks, the number of hours in forced labor shifts, the sounds of nighttime roll calls. They remembered everything, even details they had been terrified to say aloud. American personnel began documenting the accounts, recognizing immediately that these testimonies would become vital evidence for post-war investigations. Yet interviews were only one channel. The women needed a voice of their own. This realization grew from simple observations. As soon as they felt safe, many prisoners asked for paper. Some tore pieces from medical packaging or old German documents. Others tried to write on cardboard or fabric remnants. They wanted to put down what they had witnessed before memory blurred under exhaustion or time. They wanted to reclaim control over their own stories. American officers understood. They began distributing writing materials wherever possible, sometimes from Red Cross deliveries, sometimes from military stationery, sometimes even from their own notebooks. It was a small gesture in military terms, but something profound happened in the camps when that gesture spread. Women stared at blank pages as if the object itself were impossible. The freedom to write was a shock because it reversed a rule that had defined their captivity. For years, writing had been prohibited because the regime feared the permanence of truth. Now the Americans were permitting it, encouraging it, and this shift marked the first step in restoring the very thing the camps had tried hardest to erase: personal identity. And the more the women wrote, the more the Americans realized how powerful these diaries could become. Soon, this act of writing would evolve beyond personal relief or private reflection, forming a bridge between the end of captivity and the documentation of what truly happened behind the barbed wire. A bridge that would take shape fully as the broader context of liberation unfolded around them. As the American advance deepened across northern and central Germany, a new phase of responsibility emerged. One the U.S. Army had anticipated in theory, but now confronted in overwhelming reality. Millions of civilians, prisoners, and forced laborers were suddenly without overseers, documentation, or any functioning system to manage their survival. These people were classified under a developing term: displaced persons, or DPs. Within this vast population, female survivors from camps and labor sites formed a uniquely vulnerable group. Many were young, many had been separated from families, and nearly all carried the psychological imprint of continuous surveillance. The American military government, trained through wartime civil affairs programs, moved quickly to establish order. Their procedures were direct: secure the area, assess health conditions, separate prisoners from guards, collect testimonies, and prepare for evacuation to DP camps. These DP centers, temporary shelters in schools, barracks, or repurposed public buildings, became the first stable environment many women had seen in years. The Americans introduced new rules: no forced labor, no roll calls, no punishments, no limits on speech. For survivors, the sudden absence of fear created both relief and disorientation. Within these administrative frameworks, the act of writing began to carry growing significance. American officers noticed that the simple question, "What happened here?" was often met with torrents of precise memories. Women who had endured months or years of silence now spoke with urgency, afraid that unspoken details could vanish or be forgotten before anyone recorded them. Many wanted to document more than they could say aloud. They asked for paper repeatedly, sometimes apologizing for the request, as if expecting reprimand. This need to fit into broader American goals. Intelligence officers, psychological warfare units, and legal departments knew that first-hand accounts would become crucial evidence in the pursuit of war crimes. The United States had already been collecting documentation from liberated towns, abandoned Gestapo offices, and confiscated SS archives. But these sources could not replace the clarity of survivor testimony. A diary, written in the survivor's own hand at the moment of liberation, carried a weight beyond official reports. Still, the value of writing extended well beyond legal or strategic purposes. In the camps, the prohibition on keeping diaries had served as a tool of domination. It was not only about concealing crimes. It was about stripping individuals of the ability to record reality from their own perspective. Language itself had been controlled. Words were dangerous because they preserved identity and truth. Thus, when the Americans began distributing blank notebooks, sometimes even encouraging groups of women to chronicle their experiences, the emotional reaction was profound. For many survivors, the notebook symbolized the return of ownership over their thoughts. It offered a private space in a world where privacy had been systematically destroyed. It provided a channel for memories too painful to speak. It also allowed them to reconstruct timelines, names, and events blurred by exhaustion, trauma, and repeated transfers. This transition was especially meaningful in women's camps, such as Ravensbrück, a site with tens of thousands of prisoners from across Europe. Other female groups liberated near Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald satellite camps, Neuengamme subcamps, and labor detachments attached to German industries shared similar experiences. In these places, daily life had revolved around rules designed to eliminate individuality. The Americans, by contrast, introduced procedures designed to restore it. Medical teams, including Red Cross units, delivered not only food and medicine but small personal items: soap, cloth, pencils, and paper. Chaplains distributed Bibles and hymnals, many of which contained blank pages that were quickly filled with notes. Welfare officers provided structured activities meant to help survivors recover, such as letter-writing sessions or organized testimonies. Each of these gestures reinforced the message. Their voices were no longer forbidden. Yet writing was not immediately easy. Many women hesitated before touching a pencil, unsure whether the new freedom was real or temporary. Some feared that Germans would return and punish them for what they wrote. Others struggled to begin their stories, overwhelmed by the scale of what they needed to express. Trauma made memory both sharp and fragmented. Still, with time, the diaries grew. Pages filled with lists of names, friends lost, officers encountered, guards remembered. Others contained descriptions of daily routines inside camps: the cold mornings, the forced labor shifts, the hunger that shaped every decision. Some women wrote in short bursts, others in long, flowing narratives. A few wrote in multiple languages, blending words as they recalled their pre-war identities. As the American military government stabilized liberated regions, these diaries began to take on new roles. They became personal anchors in an unstable world, pieces of evidence for investigators, and historical artifacts preserving the voices of those who had nearly been erased. And soon, these writings would become central to understanding not only survival, but the many human angles that shaped this extraordinary moment. For the women who had survived years of silence, the arrival of a blank notebook struck with unexpected emotional force. At first, many reacted with caution. They touched the covers lightly, as if the object itself might be a trap. Old instincts, honed by beatings, searches, and confiscations, warned them that writing could still be dangerous. Some held the notebook, but did not open it. Others opened it, but could not bring themselves to write a single line. Their hands trembled, not from cold, but from the memory of punishment. Yet slowly, something shifted. A few women began with the simplest act, writing their names. Their own names, long denied, replaced by numbers shouted at roll call. Seeing those letters form on the page was like rediscovering part of themselves long buried. Others began writing the names of friends who had not survived. The pages filled with tributes, fragments of conversations, memories of laughter before the war. Writing allowed them to reclaim voices they feared had been lost forever. For women who felt that their lives had been reduced to mere survival, the diary became a return to selfhood. Every sentence written was a quiet act of rebuilding. And as more women wrote, confidence grew. The camp's silence, once enforced through fear, was slowly replaced by the soft scratch of pencils moving across paper. This human reawakening formed the emotional core of what the Americans had unknowingly begun. From the American military perspective, encouraging survivors to write was more than a humanitarian gesture. It was strategically beneficial. War crimes investigators needed reliable testimony, and the sooner survivors could record details, the more accurate those records would be. Memories fade quickly when exhausted bodies finally begin to rest. But writing captured information before time or health complications could alter it. American officers recognized that survivors carried precise knowledge. Camp layouts, guard routines, transport routes, execution sites, medical experiments, and names of personnel who had fled. Diaries created during liberation became primary source documents. Valuable because they were written within days of the events, untouched by later interpretations or rumors. This was not an orchestrated propaganda effort, but a practical decision shaped by military necessity. The Allies already possessed documents seized from SS offices, transport logs, and coded communications. But these materials rarely spoke to the human experience behind the numbers. A survivor's diary could describe things that official records ignored: tone of voice, daily atmosphere, personal cruelty, or moments of unexpected kindness. Commanders discovered that when women wrote without fear, they produced accounts rich with detail and clarity. These writings later guided interrogations, influenced post-war trials, and helped intelligence teams trace missing personnel. In many ways, the diaries became a map, one drawn from memory rather than cartography, allowing Allied investigators to understand the internal workings of systems previously hidden behind barbed wire. Thus, what began as a compassionate allowance evolved into a crucial tool in a wider mission to document and dismantle the machinery of the camps. Beyond the human and tactical considerations, a deeper moral transformation unfolded. For years, the women had lived in a world where truth was a liability. Falsehoods dictated their daily lives. Falsified records, manipulated numbers, fabricated charges, and propaganda that denied their suffering. Silence had been forced on them by fear. Diaries changed this dynamic. Writing allowed them to reclaim moral ownership of their own experiences. When an American officer handed a woman a notebook, he was not simply giving her paper. He was acknowledging her humanity, affirming that her memories mattered, that her suffering deserved to be recorded, and that her perspective carried value in a world that had treated her as expendable. This was a moral reversal of the camp system's core objective: the erasure of individuality. The act of documenting truth became an ethical assertion. Women wrote not only for themselves, but for those who could no longer speak. They recorded names of friends who died on transports, details of punishments that left no physical record, and descriptions of daily endurance that would otherwise vanish. Each diary represented a moral stand against the past years of dehumanization. The Americans' allowance of diary keeping signaled something else: the recognition that justice required transparency. In a world scarred by organized cruelty, truth was not just information, it was dignity restored. And from these emotional, tactical and moral angles, the significance of diary writing began to expand into even broader dimensions, reaching far into the psychological and historical impact that followed. Even after liberation, the influence of the old system lingered like a shadow that refused to recede. Women who had endured years of surveillance found it difficult to believe that the danger was truly gone. As they held the notebooks given by American soldiers, many looked instinctively over their shoulders, checking doorways and fence lines. Fear had become a reflex. It would not disappear in a single morning. Some survivors whispered as they wrote, as though trying not to be overheard. Others hid their notebooks under mattresses or inside borrowed blankets, convinced that guards might return at night. A few even asked American officers whether the notebooks would be confiscated later or whether their writings could be used against them if the Germans regained control. The terror of reprisal remained deeply rooted. This hesitation revealed a painful truth. Liberation did not erase the psychological structures built by years of oppression. The enemy's rules still lived in their minds. The SS had created a system in which self-expression was dangerous and memory was forbidden. So when the Americans encouraged writing, the emotional response was complicated. Relief mixed with disbelief, freedom shadowed by old fears. Yet with each entry added to their diaries, the women pushed that shadow further away. The very act of writing became a confrontation with the ghost of their former captors. Recording names of guards, describing punishments, and noting the cruelty they had witnessed felt like the first steps toward accountability. The enemy's presence was fading, but its psychological imprint made the push toward truth all the more urgent. The introduction of diaries into liberated camps did not happen by accident. It was shaped by individual American officers, nurses, chaplains, and welfare workers who recognized the importance of restoring agency to survivors. Many of these personnel had undergone civil affairs training, preparing them to manage populations emerging from wartime repression. But no manual fully addressed what they encountered in women's camps. Some officers noticed early on that survivors attempted to write on scraps of packaging or reused documents. They saw how women clung to pencils as though they were lifelines. Moved by these small signs, they began distributing materials more intentionally. Chaplains offered notebooks during pastoral visits. Medical teams handed out paper along with rations. Welfare officers organized writing corners in DP centers to help women document their identities and experiences for future relocation. These leaders understood that restoring dignity required more than food and shelter. It demanded the return of intellectual and emotional freedom. Encouraging diary keeping gave survivors a method to process trauma, reconnect with their sense of identity, and participate actively in shaping the historical record. Some leaders also recognized that these written accounts would guide the reconstruction of post-war Europe. Diaries helped determine who needed reunification with family members, who sought immigration, and who possessed information vital for war crimes investigations. Behind every notebook distributed was a conscious decision. That truth, written by survivors themselves, was essential to rebuilding justice. Through these acts of leadership, quiet, deliberate, and often improvised, the Americans helped shape a historical narrative that would otherwise have been lost. Writing did more than preserve memory. It became a form of psychological release. For years, the women had been forced to internalize hunger, fear, grief, and constant uncertainty. Speaking about these feelings was dangerous. Thinking too deeply about them could be overwhelming. The suppression of emotion became a survival mechanism. But once the war ended, these internal walls no longer serve a purpose. Trauma, however, does not dissolve on command. When the women began writing, many found themselves unprepared for the emotional intensity that surfaced. Some cried as they wrote. Others stopped mid-sentence, unable to continue for hours. A few wrote obsessively, page after page, trying to empty memories that had accumulated like pressure behind a dam. Psychologists who visited DP camps later noted that writing often allowed survivors to regain a sense of chronology, a crucial step in recovering from trauma. Camp life had blurred days into one another. Suffering had stretched time, while fear had compressed it. Diaries let women reconstruct events in order, making sense of experiences that had felt chaotic and endless. Writing also offered a kind of control. In the camps, they had not been able to choose their actions, their movements, or their futures. With a diary, they could choose their words. They could decide what to include and what to omit. They could reclaim ownership over the narrative of their lives. In this psychological dimension, the diary became more than a record. It became a tool for rebuilding the mind after years of survival under extraordinary pressure. And as these human, military, moral, leadership, and psychological angles converged, the stage was set for a powerful turning point. One that would transform these diaries from personal artifacts into crucial documents of history. The transformation that began with a single blank notebook reached its decisive moment in the days immediately following liberation. As American forces secured the region, teams of civil affairs officers, intelligence personnel, and medical units spread through the camps, gathering information and stabilizing lives. For the women, this period marked a turning point, a shift from mere survival toward active testimony. And it was during these critical days that the diaries moved from private emotional expression to something far larger. In the first week after liberation, American officers walked through the makeshift infirmaries, barracks, and aid stations, speaking with survivors when they were strong enough to answer questions. They noticed something striking. Women often carried their diaries with them everywhere. Some wrapped them in cloth to protect the pages. Others kept them in the pockets of donated coats, pressing them close as though guarding the most valuable possession they owned. Paper had become a new form of security. What the officers saw next shaped the unfolding climax. Many of the women began bringing forward written pages, not just to share their stories, but to ensure that crucial information would not be lost. The diaries were dense with detail, full names of guards, nicknames used inside the camp, descriptions of medical personnel, punishments, selections, transport lists, and locations of mass graves. Some included maps sketched from memory, showing where certain barracks once stood or where prisoners had been led during late-night evacuations. To the Americans, these writings were more precise than any official document they had found. The camp records left behind often contained false data or had been partially destroyed as the guards fled. But the diaries, written by those who had lived through every moment, carried a clarity that cut through the confusion of liberation. One U.S. intelligence officer, reading through several pages handed to him by a survivor, realized that her account matched exactly with reports of atrocities at a nearby subcamp. Her notes included dates, phrases shouted by guards, and descriptions of punishments that aligned with statements taken from other survivors. This consistency revealed something profound. The women's diaries were not only personal testimonies. They were independent confirmations of events happening across multiple camp systems. And it was not just the larger camps. Even satellite labor detachments, where smaller groups of women had worked in factories, agricultural fields, or military installations, produced diaries that described identical patterns of abuse. The Americans had expected to gather testimonies, but they had not anticipated the volume or precision of what the survivors brought them, written in their own hands. As word spread that American officers welcomed written accounts, more women approached with their notebooks. Some asked if their diaries could be taken to a court. Others asked if the Americans would keep them safe. A few insisted that their writings be read immediately, afraid that illness or exhaustion might claim them before their stories were heard. They wrote with urgency because they understood the fragility of memory, both their own and the world's. This was the turning point. The diaries shifted from personal reflections to primary evidence. American personnel began collecting, copying, or photographing certain entries. Intelligence officers from the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, used these writings to identify SS guards who had fled in disguise. Legal departments sent reports up the chain of command, linking the diaries to the growing body of evidence being prepared for future trials. What had begun as an act of emotional survival had become a foundation for historical accountability. Inside the DP camps, the women continued writing. Some filled entire notebooks in a matter of days. Others rewrote earlier entries in clearer handwriting, determined to provide the most accurate account possible. They chronicled events from the beginning of their arrest to the final hours inside the camps. They described the hunger that shaped every day, the violence that shaped every night, and the endurance that had kept them alive long enough to write these words at all. What emerged was a wave of truth, raw, unfiltered, and documented at the moment when silence finally broke. By mid-April 1945, American officers began organizing structured sessions where survivors could read selected diary entries aloud. These are not formal interviews, nor were they interrogations. They were, instead, acknowledgments of the women's need to speak, to be heard, and to contribute to the creation of an accurate historical record. Many wept as they read. Others stood rigid, holding the notebook in both hands, speaking in monotone to keep emotion from consuming them. Every written line became a piece of the puzzle the Allies needed to understand the machinery of oppression that had operated across the German camp system. The diaries revealed patterns that repeated across hundreds of miles, linking isolated testimonies into a unified narrative of abuse and survival. They allowed investigators to identify perpetrators, verify timelines, and reconstruct events with a level of detail that had previously been impossible. This moment, when private diaries moved into the hands of liberators, marked the climax of the story. The women's voices, once suppressed, had become central to documenting the truth. The act of writing, once forbidden, became a means of restoring justice. And soon, these diaries would lead to an even greater turning point. Their transformation from personal testimony into legal evidence that would shape the world's understanding of what had happened inside the camps. The collapse did not happen with explosions or speeches. It happened quietly, so quietly that, at first, no one believed it. For weeks, rumors had slithered through the camp. The Allies are close. The front is collapsing. The officers are preparing to run. Rumors were dangerous. Hope was dangerous. But fear was everywhere, and fear always found ways to speak. Then one night, just before dawn, the women woke to something they had never heard before. Silence. No barking orders. No boots. No keys jangling against iron doors. Only the distant thump of artillery rolling across the horizon like a storm miles away. A girl in Barack 7, a Polish seamstress named Lydia, peeked through the cracks in the wood. Her voice shook when she whispered, "The watchtower is empty." The older women didn't believe it. The younger ones were too afraid to hope. But as the sun crept over the barren yard, a truth unfolded slowly, unbelievably. The guards had fled, every single one of them. Doors stood unlocked. The administration office was abandoned mid-meal. Coffee still warm, papers scattered, a half-written report frozen in place. Some women rushed to the gates, only to stop a few steps away, paralyzed by years of conditioning. Leaving without orders felt like touching a flame. Others dropped to their knees, too weak to stand, too shocked to cry. But not everyone celebrated. For many, freedom was not a doorway thrown open. It was a terrifying question. What happens now? Because the world outside those fences, the homes they once knew, the families they hoped had survived, felt just as unknown as the prison they were desperate to escape. And in that moment of suspended breath, before the Americans arrived, before the notebooks appeared, before history remembered their words, they were simply women standing in the ruins of a nightmare, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell them they belonged to life again. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, each step echoing with memories none of them wanted, but all of them carried. At the end of it stood a steel door, scratched, dented, its paint peeling like old scabs. An American lieutenant pushed it open, and a stale draft of dust rolled out. Inside was a storage room, or rather, a graveyard of stolen lives. Shelves sagged under the weight of boxes filled with objects the women had once fought to keep. Hair combs, letters, torn scraps of family photographs, children's drawings, wedding rings stripped from fingers. Items taken for security, they were told. But everyone knew the truth. The camp had worked hard to erase them. Elena froze at the threshold. She recognized the place from rumors whispered in the barracks. A dozen women stepped in, and the silence changed, thickened, heavy with the shock of seeing the tangible remains of who they used to be. A corporal cracked open a crate. Inside lay dozens of small cloth bundles. Prisoner property, tagged and numbered. "Start looking," he said softly. "We'd like to return what belongs to you." But no one moved, not at first, because the sight of their own memories, locked away and stacked like discarded tools, was more frightening than the camp had ever been. Then Elena stepped forward. Her fingers landed on a bundle tied with faded blue thread. The same thread she'd once sewn in her coat so she could find it if it were ever taken. Her breath caught. Her hand shook. Inside that bundle was something she never thought she would see again. Elena untied the blue thread with trembling fingers. The cloth peeled open slowly, like a wound remembering how to breathe. Inside was a small, battered notebook, its corners crushed, its cover warped from sweat and rain. She recognized it instantly. She had sewn that notebook into the lining of her coat during the first months of imprisonment, writing in it secretly at night. Scraps of memory, names of the missing, half-formed prayers she never dared speak aloud. When the guards found it during a routine search, they ripped it away from her. She'd watched them carry it off, certain it would be tossed into the furnace along with everything else considered unnecessary. But somehow it was here. A thin gasp escaped her. Other women, drawn by her quiet shock, stepped closer. "Is that? It survived? They kept it." Elena opened the notebook. Half the pages were gone, torn out. The ones left were stained, smudged, some barely legible. But they were hers. A whisper rippled through the room as more boxes were opened and other women found their own lost fragments. Lockets, letters, scraps of poems, small religious tokens, combs, cloth pieces from home. Some recognized nothing. Others collapsed to their knees, clutching what little remained of their before. One American medic wiped her eyes discreetly, pretending to adjust her glasses. "Take your time," she murmured. "Everything here belongs to someone." Then she added, almost as if speaking to the room itself, "Not even a camp like this could burn every memory." Elena pressed the notebook to her chest. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her story returning to her hands. In the days that followed, the notebooks became more than personal relief. Officers, intelligence agents, and investigators began collecting selected diaries, carefully cataloging them for evidence. The fragile pages, once hidden in linings and under floorboards, were now examined with reverence. Every word mattered. Every name, date, and detail could identify a perpetrator, confirm a timeline, or expose a camp's inner workings. Elena watched as her own notebook and those of others were carefully copied, photographed, and sometimes read aloud in small, controlled sessions. Each reading was a revelation. The mundane details of daily life juxtaposed with the terror that had surrounded them. The American officers noted patterns, recurrent abuses, transport routes, guard routines that had been invisible in fragmented reports or official files. The survivors themselves were transformed by the process. Writing had been a private act. Now it became a statement of authority. Their words carried weight. Their memories shaped investigations. For the first time, they were not only witnesses, They were historians, chroniclers of experiences the world needed to understand. One afternoon, Elena watched a small group of women read entries aloud to a military legal officer. The officer nodded quietly, taking meticulous notes. Each passage provided evidence for war crimes trials that would soon unfold in Nuremberg and elsewhere. Pages once hidden from view had become instruments of justice. The notebook's journey, from secret concealment to public documentation, marked a crucial turning point in the aftermath of liberation. They bridged the private suffering endured in silence and the emerging global understanding of Nazi atrocities. In their hands, the women's voices, long suppressed, nearly extinguished, found a permanent place in history. And as the diaries accumulated, as testimonies were cross-referenced, and as investigators pieced together events from multiple camps, the liberation of memory itself became a battlefield of its own, a victory of survival, truth, and the unbroken human spirit. The liberation of the camps marked the end of captivity, but for the women who had survived, it was only the beginning of another struggle. This time to reclaim their identities, rebuild their lives, and confront a world irrevocably changed. The diaries they had begun during the first days of freedom became both shields and guides in this uncertain landscape. For many, they were the only tangible record of a life that the Nazis had attempted to erase. Immediately after liberation, the American military worked to stabilize displaced persons. Temporary camps were organized, sometimes in repurposed schools, factories, or military barracks. Women who had been separated from families were registered, given medical care, and encouraged to rest. But these centers were also spaces where diaries played a practical role. Officers, psychologists, and civil affairs teams began reviewing the notebooks to understand survivors' needs. Missing relatives, medical conditions, and even logistical details about who had been transported and where. Every diary held clues to the human puzzle the Allies faced. Some of the notebooks were collected for official purposes. War crimes investigators, including personnel from the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, and the Office of Military Government for Germany, OMGUS, relied on these first-hand accounts to corroborate information from other sources, seized German documents, witness statements, and intelligence reports. A woman's diary could confirm the identity of a guard who had vanished, track the route of a forced labor transport, or document atrocities previously undocumented. In this way, private writing became an essential instrument of justice. At the same time, many diaries remained with the women themselves. They continued to write daily, often in makeshift conditions, candlelight in barracks, scraps of paper when notebooks ran out, or copied passages into new journals. Writing became an act of survival in its own right, a means of processing trauma, maintaining mental stability, and asserting control over a fractured world. Psychological officers later noted that the survivors who wrote regularly displayed stronger coping mechanisms, clearer memory recollection, and a greater sense of agency than those who did not. By mid-1945, word spread across the DP camps that diary keeping was not only permitted but encouraged. Women shared tips, swapped notebooks, and even began forming small writing circles. The act of documenting life in the camps created a fragile sense of community among survivors. They were bound not just by shared suffering, but by the deliberate recording of truth, a silent rebellion that persisted even beyond the barbed wire and watchtowers. American officers recognized the dual importance of the diaries: personal healing and historical documentation. Some notebooks were carefully archived in military administrative offices. Others were later transferred to the International Red Cross and Allied intelligence bureaus. Thousands of pages would eventually inform trials, scholarly research, and public accounts of the Holocaust. For the women who had written them, the diaries were at once evidence, testament, and memory, a bridge between the horror they endured and the justice that the world was beginning to impose. The process was gradual. Many women were reluctant to hand over their diaries, fearing the loss of personal ownership. Others were hesitant to share the rawest details of brutality, still haunted by fear of reprisal or shame. Yet, over time, trust in the Allied officers and in the permanence of these records allowed the diaries to serve their dual purpose, recording history while preserving the individual voice. In these early months after liberation, the notebooks became instruments of empowerment. They allowed survivors to document their survival, to chronicle loss, and to assert their humanity against a world that had sought to strip it away. For the Americans, for historians, and for the women themselves, these writings transformed a personal act of preservation into a vital component of post-war reconstruction, both of the physical world and of human memory. As weeks turned into months, the diaries continued to shape life in the displaced persons camps and beyond. For many women, returning to a semblance of normalcy required confronting the past, and their notebooks became the lens through which they understood what had happened to them, and to the millions of others who had suffered. Writing allowed them to organize fragmented memories, piece together timelines, and preserve the names of those who had disappeared into the void of the camps. In effect, the diaries became both a compass and a map, guiding them through the emotional and logistical challenges of post-liberation life. Some of these women, armed with their detailed accounts, participated directly in investigations and trials. The notebooks provided corroboration for eyewitness testimonies presented at the Nuremberg trials and other war crimes proceedings across Germany and Austria. Pages describing daily routines, guard rotations, and locations of atrocities gave prosecutors precision that was impossible to achieve with oral testimony alone. In several cases, diary entries led investigators to previously undiscovered mass graves, work sites, and evidence caches. The women's private writings became, unexpectedly, instruments of legal authority and justice. Yet not every diary was submitted to authorities. Many remained personal, a sanctuary of private reflection. These writings allowed survivors to process grief, commemorate lost loved ones, and maintain a connection to the pre-war lives that the camps had attempted to erase. Psychological studies conducted by Allied medical teams later highlighted the therapeutic power of diary keeping. Women who wrote consistently demonstrated improved coping mechanisms, stronger memory recall, and a reinforced sense of identity. The notebooks were simultaneously historical records and tools for emotional survival. In the longer term, the preservation of these diaries had profound implications for post-war history and collective memory. Scholars, journalists, and archivists drew upon the pages to reconstruct the lived experiences of female prisoners, filling gaps that official documents and photographs could never fully address. Diaries revealed the emotional, social, and psychological dimensions of camp life, details often absent from statistical reports or military records. Through these writings, the individual voices of women who had been systematically silenced were restored to the historical narrative. Perhaps most importantly, the act of writing helped the women reclaim agency over their own stories. The same blank pages that had once seemed impossible became tools of empowerment. They allowed survivors to assert, in clear handwriting, that they had endured, observed, and remembered. This reclamation of voice, combined with the diary's utility in documenting atrocities, symbolized a broader moral victory, a reversal of the very system that had sought to erase memory and humanity. By the end of 1945, thousands of pages have been collected, shared, or preserved by their authors. They represented a network of truth, meticulously recorded by the hands of women who had lived through unimaginable hardship. In these pages lay the delicate balance of history, both personal and universal, private grief transformed into evidence, silence converted into testimony. And the impact of these writings would resonate for decades, informing not only our understanding of the Holocaust, but also the broader study of human endurance, memory, and the profound need to record one's own story after surviving oppression. As the immediate aftermath settled into long-term recovery, the diaries remained central, not only to historical reconstruction and justice, but also to the quiet, ongoing work of healing. The stage was set for reflection, an understanding of what these writings truly meant, and why allowing women to keep diaries was one of the most profound acts of liberation in the closing days of the war. The diaries of female prisoners, quietly penned in the aftermath of liberation, represent more than historical documents. They are enduring testaments to the resilience of the human spirit. In the camps, these women had been stripped of names, identities, and autonomy. They had been forbidden even to record their thoughts, to preserve memories, to assert the reality of their existence. When American officers handed them blank notebooks, they were not merely offering paper. They were restoring agency, dignity, and the power to witness. Through their writing, the women reclaimed a voice the world had tried to silence. Each line, each name, each fragment of daily life recorded in those pages became an assertion of truth against systematic erasure. The notebooks were private, yet they carried the potential to speak publicly, to guide investigations, to corroborate evidence, to ensure that justice could be pursued. In them, trauma was acknowledged, memory was preserved, and survival was documented in the most intimate yet enduring way. The act of writing also reveals a broader lesson about the human need to bear witness. Even in the shadow of unimaginable cruelty, the survivors sought to impose order on chaos, to structure memory, and to share experience. Their diaries bridged the personal and the collective, linking private anguish to historical understanding. They transformed the ephemeral into the permanent, converting moments of fear and suffering into testimony that would outlast the perpetrators themselves. Ultimately, allowing these women to keep diaries was an act of profound liberation. It demonstrated that freedom is not only the absence of physical chains, but the restoration of thought, expression, and moral agency. These diaries remind us that memory is both fragile and powerful, that writing can be a tool for justice, healing, and historical truth. In a world ravaged by systematic attempts to erase humanity, the simple permission to write became a radical act, one that allowed survivors to reclaim themselves, to testify, and to ensure that the past, however painful, would never be forgotten. The pages turned, the stories recorded, and through them, history was given a voice it could not ignore.